Well, hello. I got a really great story here. It's out of Chicken Soup for the Soul, and it's for the gardener's soul, excuse me. It's named As Thyself. In the peaceful years before the Second World War, two rose farmers lived across the street from each other in the town of Richmond in Northern California. Francis Abe was of Swiss descent, and Tamaki Neomaya was Japanese. The two men's fathers had settled in Richmond at the turn of the century, a long time ago. They had built the neat homes that faced each other, and they had started growing roses and selling them in San Francisco. Although they were competitors, they also became friends, and their young sons played together after school. By the start of World War II, Francis and Tamaki had taken over their father's businesses, and both had become modestly successful. Roses from the two farms had earned well-deserved reputations for their long vase life. The families worked too hard to socialize much, but they enjoyed visiting each other on occasion, and the children played together as their fathers had once done. Then December 7, 1941 arrived. With the bombing of Pearl Harbor, wow, life changed for most Americans, but especially for those of Japanese descent. In Richmond, rumors circulated that a car owned by a Japanese family had been overturned, and that a greenhouse owned by a Japanese farmer had been vandalized. There was frightening talk of people being sent to something called internment camps. One day Francis walked over to Tamaki's house with his wife Carrie and two children. When Tamaki greeted them at the door, Francis said, "We've lived across the street from each other for a long time." Three generations, Tamaki said, nodding to the five children around him. Francis made it clear that if the need arose, Tamaki could count on him to look after his property. It was something they had both learned as boys in church. Love thy neighbor as thyself. You would do the same for us, he said. Soon after that visit, President Franklin Roosevelt signed an executive order that identified military areas from which certain people could be excluded. Much of the entire state of California was designated as such an area. This was the first sign that the relocation of Japanese Americans to camps was about to become a reality. Now it was Tamaki's turn to visit Francis. He arrived carrying the family's most valuable possession, an ornamental Japanese doll dressed in an elaborate costume of black and white silk, housed in a glass case. Tamaki offered it to Francis as a gift. Francis told Tamaki that he couldn't accept the doll as a gift, but he did agree to hold it for the Ninomayas until things get back to normal. A month later, Tamaki arrived again. This time, he handed Francis his bank book. On a cold February day, less than a month later, a black sedan pulled up to the Ninomaya's home. The Abes watched as four men dressed in in business suits escorted Tamaki to the car and took him away with only the work clothes on his back. That same day, Tamaki's pregnant wife, Hayane, and their 5 children went to stay with friends in Livingston, in Central California, hoping to avoid the same fate as Tamaki. They loaded their pickup truck with clothes, a few pots and pans, and some favorite toys with tears in their eyes. Hayane drove away from the home that Tamaki's father had built with his own hands. But they found no protection in Livingston. Soon after they arrived, they were sent to Grenada, Colorado. Along with hundreds of other Japanese families, they were assigned to wooden barracks covered with tar paper and surrounded by barbed wire. Armed guards watched over their every move. But the worst discovery was that Tamaki was at another camp, and no one could tell them where. Back in Richmond, Francis Abbey was determined to keep both his own and his neighbor's nursery running. This required many long hours of grueling labor in order to qualify for a farmer's ration of fuel. Francis had to clear out many of the lovely rose bushes in both greenhouses and plant tomatoes and cucumbers instead. He did manage to save a few choice rose bushes in each. For tomorrow, he told his children, months turned into years. The whole Abbey family now had to labor with Francis to keep the nurseries operating. The children worked in the greenhouses before school and on weekends. Still, Francis routinely worked 16 and 17 hours a day. During the next 3 years, a letter occasionally arrived from the internment camp. The abbess celebrated when Hayane's child was delivered safely, but the happiest news came a year later when Tamaki was allowed to join his family in Grenada and to meet for the first time his new son. At long last, the war ended. Sitting in the cafeteria in the camp, the Nehemiahs heard the announcement over the public address system that they were going home. As the family packed up their few belongings and boarded a train, Tamaki's relief was mingled with apprehension about what they were returning to. In his letters, Francis had it reported that all was well at the Nehemiah's nursery, yet it was only natural for Tamaki to wonder if this could possibly be true. Many Japanese Americans returned to find their homes burned down or their property looted. At the very least, they knew their homes would be in terrible disrepair. When the train pulled into the Richmond station, Francis Abbey was waiting on the platform. Both Francis and Tamaki had grown so thin and drawn they barely recognized each other. As Tamaki stepped onto the platform, they shook hands awkwardly, feeling shy about the emotions that welled up. As they rode through the familiar streets, the Nehemiahs looked anxiously around at the changes the 3 years had brought to their hometown. Finally, the car rolled into the driveway of their home. The children spilled out of the car, followed by Tamaki and Hayane. Then they all stood and stared in silence. The nursery was exactly as they had last seen it, only now there were vegetables growing along with the roses. It was so clean, the panes sparkled in the sunlight, and healthy plants crowded the walkways. Carrie Abbey and the Abbey children came running across the street, and the two women embraced. Together the families entered the Nehemiah's home. Everything was spotless, and the family's possessions were just where they had left them. The Japanese silk doll was back in its place of honor. The Nehemiah's bank book was on the dining room table, full of deposit slips from the sale of Tamaki's roses and vegetables in San Francisco. And the kitchen counter, on the kitchen counter, a single red rose stood in a bud vase, the gift of a man who had learned as a child to love thy neighbor as thyself. This story was written by DeVos. I hope you liked it. I always like that story. Thank you.